Well, welcome everybody. We might get formalities underway. There may be a few people that continue to join us. Welcome to this breakfast roundtable webinar this morning. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Alison Airy and I'm the CEO of ACBC New South Wales. Thank you for joining us so early in the morning, and I do hope everybody is staying safe and sane during this lockdown that we are experiencing in Sydney at the moment. We're really delighted to be covering this theme on this breakfast webinar this morning. Selling your products and services into China means first and foremost that you need to be visible, and that's very difficult if all your collateral is in English. So we thought it would be wonderful to do a webinar on how to put together a webinar in Chinese, particularly if you don't have strong Chinese skills. The breakfast format is generally one where we like a lot of interaction, and it's an opportunity for people to meet each other. It's unfortunately not so possible with this webinar format. So what we thought we'd do was from 8:45, we might promote everybody to a panelist, which would essentially take the webinar into a meeting format, and that way that will facilitate more of a discussion around the room. So if you'd like to stay on for that, please do, but of course you don't need to. But I think that would be a really nice opportunity for us to all speak to each other and have more of a free-flowing conversation. So I might introduce our speaker for this morning. She may be well known to people on this webinar, but Lisa Goodhand, who's our marketing and membership manager on a part-time basis. Lisa is also a long-standing businesswoman in the China space. She speaks fluent Chinese, and 13 years ago, she set up her company, China Blueprint. And I'll get Lisa to say a bit about what China Blueprint does. But she speaks and writes regularly about doing business in China, and she's had a lot of experience in business in sectors such as food, tourism and lifestyle, and has helped her clients really connect with Chinese customers. If you have any questions as we're going along or any comments, please share those. We have the Q&A function down the bottom, or just use the chat function to say hello to others on the webinar this morning. So Lisa, I will hand over to you.
Okay, thank you, Alison, and welcome everyone. It's good to have you here today. Just quickly, China Blueprint, we are an Australian Sydney-based company, have been helping Australian exporters, small and medium-sized, with their market entry strategies into mainland China for many years now. In fact, we had to do a quick calculation this morning to figure out how many years, and that's 13 years now, which seems like, doesn't seem like that long, but when you think about it, it's quite a long time. So that's helping them with everything to understanding what their business opportunity is in China, and then how to activate that, how to enter the market, the types of challenges and barriers that they're going to face, and how to overcome them, how to develop their marketing strategies. And so for quite a while now, we've been helping these businesses develop their China website strategy. So I've actively participated in strategizing, and then all the way through to activation of a brand new Chinese language website, and including things such as activating WeChat service accounts, Weibo, Youku, all of the kind of online social media and marketing tools that they'll need to then kind of help build up their presence through marketing channels. So today we're going to talk about building a Chinese website more specifically, and I'm open to any question at the end, because this is by no means going to be a comprehensive overview of building a website. And I need to put out there first and foremost that I am no web engineer. So it's not going to be too techy. If some of you are really technically oriented out there and have any specific technical questions, I'm happy to take them on and attempt to answer them, but it's more likely that I'll have to forward that on to one of my technicians and see if they can get an answer back to you. So, yeah, it's not going to be a technical discussion, more of a general, broad overview of just a couple of the important things to consider if you're an Australian company attempting or at the kind of beginning stage of developing a web presence for the China market. I think these days it's important to understand that as a business, we are all now global businesses. Especially COVID has made that point really poignantly, that if you don't have an online presence of sorts, if you get locked down, it becomes very difficult to do business. And at the ACBC, we certainly know that. Being an events organisation, all of a sudden we realised that we've had to move all of our events online. And so being online now is not so uncommon, although it really wasn't that long ago that, you know, there were companies that were pushing to understand whether or not they needed to have a website, never alone kind of a multi-language or a global web presence. The challenge has now become not so much do I have a web presence, but how do I make my website or my web presence global? How do I enter the global market? And especially into a country such as China, which is so complex and there are so many barriers to entry, a lot of which we don't understand here in Australia. Let me start by first giving you an analogy, and that explains the picture that you're looking at. And the analogy is that just because you dress something up in Chinese clothes, it doesn't necessarily make it Chinese or China ready in the case of business, which is probably more my point. So these cute little Aussie girls, one of them's my daughter, we dress them up in traditional Chinese kind of dynasty era type clothing, and they look cute. And, you know, you could say, yep, that's Chinese, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate and make it a market ready product for China. So that's an important takeaway to think about when it comes to planning and building a Chinese language website. It's not just a case of plugging in Google Translate and your job's done. It's far more complex than that, and there are lots of things that you need to think about, such as culture. Is this photo offensive? Are they wearing, you know, the right clothing? Are some of the clothing from just different dynasties, in which this case they are? Things like language and politics, of course. So that's a little analogy for you to take away. We'll go to slide 2. So I want to start by first thinking about why you would want to build a Chinese website, because it's not just a case of translating your website and leaving there. There is a lot more functionality around having a multilingual website or a Chinese language website. Do you know, not that long ago, but some years ago, even luxury brands used to fight the need for having Chinese language assets, because they felt like it took them away from provenance, or, you know, it made them not so luxury. So it's important that we've made that transition now, and we're at the stage that we actually believe that having a website in Chinese, if our customer base is in mainland China, or even in Australia, in fact, because we have over 1 million Chinese locally, that having a Chinese language offer is more than just about translating your content and leaving it out there for your customers. It actually has a much bigger role. 2 points that I want to make: that when you have a multilingual website, is it shows your customers that you are a global business. It makes you look bigger. And in China, we know that bigger is better. So it also shows that your customers, that you care about them as a brand, by being able to share with them information about your products and show that you care about them by translating to their own language and presenting to them kind of options that suit, you know, their needs. It makes them more comfortable and more committed to engaging with you. It also allows you to transact with your customers. There are a lot of things in Australia that we take for granted that actually aren't available in China. So some companies in Australia rely heavily on Facebook and YouTube marketing, things that are not available in China. And it goes all the way down the line to e-commerce tools as well. So some e-commerce tools that we use in Australia, again, are not available in China. So by scaling up your website and, you know, building in that functionality, you're going to allow your customers to actually transact with you when they otherwise might not be able to. And I'll give you some examples of this a little bit later with customers that we've worked with. provide your customers with useful information. So if you have a company or a product that has a lot of information around it, or education is a part of your marketing style, then having that information available to your customers is going to, again, help them build confidence in your product. One thing that I'm going to touch on today, which I think is really important, is customer support. So attracting customers to your website or to your company or brand is great, but if you can't then reciprocate by communicating with them, then you're pretty much, you know, it's a wasted opportunity. And there are lots of AI tools out there that allow you at the entry level to plug into your website and allow you to communicate in Chinese with your customers fairly easily, and without the need to have to employ a Chinese staff, for example, or, you know, a more comprehensive kind of customer service management strategy. And so we're going to touch on some of those tools a little bit later. So if you bring your customers to your website to learn about you, have some support tools in place so that they can transact with you. And this is another one that I like, especially for, I've seen this really successful in tourism businesses, is it can also be a tool for your staff in store. So when tourists come into your store and they might not have English, or they want to speak Chinese, but their English is limited, if you have a tool such as a website and your staff are familiar with the website and the layout, they might be able to point those customers to certain aspects of your business to help kind of fix problems or answer questions, so to speak. So we've used this quite a lot in the tourism industry. Your website obviously is available on an iPad. You can see the photo here that I've kind of given you as a demonstration. You can walk around and you can show your customers in store without the need for you having to speak Chinese, but you can show them that you have a Chinese language offer, and that might help move them more towards the purchase phase. So there's lots of reasons. These are not all the reasons why you should have a Chinese language website if Chinese customers are part of your business strategy. Okay, so I'm going to do the compulsory stats slide for the numbers people in the webinar today. So Alice, Joanna, if you could just move to the next one for me. So China is no doubt the largest online community and e-commerce market in the world. And these are the stats as of December 2020. There are 890, well, actually, that should be 890. What have I got? 890 million netizens in China. That gives China a market penetration of around about 70.4%. In Australia, I think we're about 43 times smaller if we did a comparison. Our penetration rate is still a lot higher. However, the actual sheer volume of people on the internet in China is massive, and it's quite significant. Of those 989 million, I got it right that time, netizens, there are 986 million mobile internet users. And I put that stat in there because that's an important one to think about when you're building your website or web presence in China. You need to be mobile friendly. Okay, so you're going to need to have a responsive mobile website when you build it, because a lot of those netizens in China are actually using their mobile phones to view information and to check online. And then the size of the online shopping market in China is 782 million. So they're not all on there just watching, well, it wouldn't be Netflix or YouTube because they're banned, but they're online watching TV and shows, but a large proportion of them are actually shopping. So the shopping online community in China is also really, really strong. So that makes China a really interesting market to consider. And I think being the largest online e-commerce market in the world makes it definitely something that you would want to consider if you are an exporter or even a small to medium-sized company that's contemplating expanding their own customer base, because now there are all the tools available to help you kind of get the process started. So we're going to go to the next slide. So the reason that I put this slide in first is because even before you start the process of building a website or planning to build your website, if you have an inclination that you are going to start marketing to China or the Chinese market, you need to register your domain name in China. And as a global business, having a domain name means that you will take a country suffix of the country you plan to sell to. So in China, the most common one is .cn. So for example, and I've given you an example on the slide there, my company name is China Blueprint. I have ChinaBlueprint.com. I have ChinaBlueprint.com.au, but I would also take out ChinaBlueprint.com, .cn, the most popular one, and .com.cn. And taking a domain name these days is really easy. I mean, you can jump online right now. There's plenty of companies that will help you register. GoDaddy, any of those now, they all offer the ability to take a domain name in China. You also have the option to use your domain name in Chinese characters, although this is not very popular, and I'm not even sure if people use this one anymore. And then the last thing that you would do is once you develop your Chinese name, so I have an English name, China Blueprint. I also have a Chinese name, Lanhua Guojiguan Gongsi, and I've abbreviated that. And as you can see here, I've also taken out Lanhua Guoji.cn, Lanhua Guoji.com.cn. So they're things to think about, really simple to do. Take them out. Even if you don't go down the process of building a website, it will protect you from domain squatters and copycats. And if your product or service becomes popular in China, it's very likely that you will be copied. It's the same across the world. And that at least if you've parked those domain names, they're safe and they're available to you when you want to use them. If you had to buy those domain names off somebody else, it could be a very expensive process. Okay, so we're going to go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about platforms now, because the next thing that you will want to do in the planning phase is think about the type of website that you want to build. Are you just going to make an extension of your existing English language website? For example, add Chinese language pages? Or are you actually going to build a brand new website? Because that's what some companies do. And that'll come down to your brand strategy. There are also other options that you could consider, such as building a web presence on a third-party platform. The only problem I have with that is that it's expensive, and if you no longer wish to work with that platform, you lose all of your collateral. And some people consider that maybe just a social media account, such as a WeChat or a Weibo account, might be sufficient. I think that's a good idea, and I think that's a part of your whole strategy. But I still think that having some format of a web presence, even if it's just an extension of your existing website, is going to be critical to your business in China, for all of the reasons we mentioned before. So it shows you're a global business, it shows that you care about your customers, et cetera, et cetera. So you're going to need to choose the type of website that you want to build if you decide to go down the new website platform. And there are lots of options. I've included in here an example of an Amazon global website. So they call it a global website, and they have different languages for different countries. This one is for China. And what a global website looks like is a template website of the English version with matching versions in different languages. So there's not a real deviation in each of the different countries. It looks very similar, but for all intents and purposes, the language has changed. And they also tweak certain things like the tools, such as the payment tools and the contact tools, etc., and the customer service type options. I have noticed that Amazon Global has started to tweak some of the imagery a little bit, but for all intents and purposes, this looks very much like the Western version or the US version of Amazon. You might choose that path, or you might choose a completely different look and feel to your existing English or Australian website, and I'll show you some examples of that shortly. If you are going to use your own platform, there's an important rule to doing this. You need to undertake some research before you go about this. The first thing is to check that your website is currently viewable in China, because there are actually many websites, unbeknownst to their owners, that can't be viewed by your Chinese customers in mainland China. And that's because the hosting company or the web platform or the technology that they're using, such as YouTube, is all banned in China. And so they're actually, if you just do a Google search, you can actually jump online and do a test to see if your website is currently visible in China. The second most important thing to do is, if it is visible, check the download speed, because download speed is really important to customer experience. If it takes too long for your customers to download your website or your pages, they're just going to jump off your website and go to someone else who's quicker and more convenient. So again, jump on Google. There are plenty of pages out there that will help you test your download speed, because it's not just social apps like Facebook and Instagram that are actually banned in China. And you'll need to check with your web designer whether or not your technology is accessible in China, because it includes things like blogging websites, search engines, streaming apps, cloud storage, all the different things. Everyone's website is different, and you have lots of different technology kind of involved in that website. So it's really important to check your download speed and whether or not it's banned. There are ways of getting around the download speed if it's a problem for your website. And that's a little bit more technical, but we can talk about that after the presentation if that's one of your concerns. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. Because I want to talk about design and layout. So, okay, we've got some images here, which I'll just give you a few minutes to kind of absorb. So this is the McDonald's Australian versus Chinese versus USA websites. And you can see that they're slightly different. One of the things that I find when I'm talking to people that are thinking about building a Chinese language web presence is they're really confused about how to go about it. What do I change? What do I keep the same? Will the Chinese like my color? But sometimes I don't even ask those questions. Do these symbols resonate with Chinese consumers? So at the beginning of any website build, and after you decide the technology behind the website, you need to decide what the website layout and design is going to include. You also need to think about language and marketing language. So again, harping on the Google Translate app. Google is a great translation tool for simple translation, but it doesn't provide marketing translation. Now, if we deep dive into these images here from kindly donated by McDonald's, you can start to see some of the localization strategies that McDonald's uses in each of their countries. If we look to the left, you can see that in Australia, clearly we're trying to create this persona that McDonald's is healthy. Hey, we've got grass-fed beef burgers. And our beef and chicken is 100% Aussie, meaning that, it's not cardboard, as is the presumption. But so the top of any website, China or Australia or any country, is always going to be premium land, real estate. That's where you send your most important message. So a great way to find out what kind of you might want to do for your website is to look at your competitor websites and see what they're doing. As you can see on the China website, when this picture was taken last year, so it was kind of at the peak of the COVID pandemic, hygiene is, a really important message that they put up there in the top left corner, one of the, the most important spots. But then on the right, they're talking about discounts. So again, special offers and discounts are really important to them as well. They haven't mentioned too much about, provenance and guaranteed authentic beef. And then to the right, just quickly, the American website, zero delivery fees. So, you can imagine that home delivery is probably one of their kind of premium concerns, making it convenience, all about convenience. One of the other things, I don't know if you noticed or not, is the logo. So in the China and the USA logo, they're both kind of very simple golden arches, big M. But on the Australian logo, they've kept the I'm loving it original logo with the red background, which is really interesting. When you take your brand to a new market, you need to adapt certain elements of your brand assets, and that may include the logo. So in this case, McDonald's has decided that, you know, in China, they're going to move away from the I'm loving it strategy with that particular logo, and they have a more simplified golden arches logo in all of their marketing communications. So little things can make, you know, a big difference when it comes to building your website. And the point that I want to make here is that think about the color of your website. What is the message that is being sent through your colors? What icons are you using? What images are you using? Should you outline your images in black? Should you use black and white images? Do they resonate with Chinese consumers? So you're going to need to do your market research even before you start building your website. The other really important point that I'd like to make here is that it's not just about the visual beautification of your website, but it's also about important, more functional aspects of your website. So things like currencies, things like weights. What weight system do they use in China? I'll put the question out there for you. Is it the same as ours? Times and currencies. Times are particularly important because obviously we have a time difference. If you're asking your customers to call you, make sure it's not 4 in the morning. You know, make sure you set out on your website, if you can't answer at 4 in the morning, that these are your time zones. So all of these kind of functional aspects also need to be incorporated into your web development and adapted to suit your China market. Some of your brand elements and offerings may need to change. Some will be exactly the same, but it's important to think about it before you start the planning and building process, because once you build it, changes can be very expensive. Okay, so the next slide. So I did mention that I was going to talk about communication tools. If you build a really, you know, fantastic web presence or have a web offer, and bring lots of Chinese customers to your website, you're also going to want to be able to service them. And some of you are sitting there saying, hey, I can't do that. I don't speak Chinese and I don't have Chinese staff. And in the current economic environment, I'd suggest that getting new staff can be quite an expensive prospect as well. So there are now a lot of tools out there, and these tools have become really sophisticated that will actually allow you to plug in some functionality to your website that will help you communicate with your customers. So I've got some suggestions here. On the top line is all of our kind of Western style tools. If you were in China, you'd be using things like QQ, WeChat, you know, Tencent Cloud for Zoom conferencing, Youku to, you know, project to your customers. But if you don't have access to those in Australia and you want to use your own kind of tools that you're more kind of familiar with, then there are adaptations to things that we already know. So Skype, for example, has a Chinese language app. So if you were encouraging your customers to call you, you could actually use the Skype business language app to facilitate a very basic conversation, but a conversation in any case. Google Translate, I love Google Translate. I use it a lot, even though I speak Chinese. There are lots of words that I don't know. You can use it, and you can actually scan an image with your phone. I don't know if you know or not, but if you scan an image, it will actually translate Chinese to English and vice versa. So say, for example, if you're in a shop and you're trying to explain to your Chinese customer a word or a meaning, you could just type it in, or you could scan an image and then the Chinese version would come up for them. Google and Microsoft have also come, you know, a long way in developing artificial intelligence for language translation. And they can now, you can work with either Microsoft or Google to, you know, if you've got large volumes of documentation to be translated, it could be a very expensive process. It might be easier for you to go down in the first instance, you know, using an AI or a translation app to help you develop your first draft version translation, and then, you know, at least you can get that large volume kind of under control. And then there are apps like Zoho Desk. So these days, I don't know, but every time I jump onto a website, a little bubble pops up and someone says, hey, can I help you? I find it kind of useful, except in the times when I say yes, and they say, okay, we'll get back to you in 24 hours. But anyway, these apps are basically being developed to capture a customer when they're on your website and connect with them to try to answer their or identify what their problem is and progress them to the next phase. Now, there is actually technology available now, such as with Zoho Desk, where they can communicate in multiple languages. So for example, if you plugged in this app to your website and you found a Chinese customer was on your website, firstly, the app would identify that the query is coming from China or a Chinese language website, and they would send the initial question out in Chinese to that customer. That customer would then answer in Chinese. You would get the question in English. You could type the answer in English and it would be translated back to the customer. So it's a great way to capture a customer when they're on your website and communicate even when you can't speak Chinese. Again, it's not foolproof. It's an app, it's a robot, but it's a great way to kind of at least get the conversation started. If you could maybe engage that customer a little bit more, define them as a genuine prospect, you could then move them on to like a language speaker. But it's a great little tool. They're not that expensive anymore. They're readily available and there's lots of competition around this space. So there's plenty of options there for you to choose from. So definitely look at all the different options available that you can plug into your website. They allow you to communicate with your customers even if you don't speak Chinese. They give you an entry level or a proof of concept to determine whether or not there is actually an interest for your product in China or with Chinese customers, and can potentially get you to the next stage where once you build up a decent kind of case for your business or a decent customer size, you can perhaps move to the next level where you would get a Chinese speaking staff member. So in the next slide, what I'm going to do to finish off is talk about a customer case that we worked on, and to make the point that you really need to do your research. And people don't like to hear that word research because it means lots of work and time and quite often can be kind of an expensive process. But this is really important part of your website building program because it will help you avoid mistakes and it will help you kind of fast track you into providing a better customer experience for your Chinese customers and essentially build your brand. So many years ago, we were asked by Port Arthur in Tasmania to have a look at their website. They had an English website and they had some Chinese content on the website. They felt like they weren't getting the most out of their inbound tourism market. And they'd been hearing all of the news about large volumes of Chinese tourists coming to Tasmania, to Australia, and they didn't feel like they were capturing their audience very well, and they wanted to improve their ticket sales. So we took the project on and we had a look and we did the research, and we started by looking at their website to determine what the problem was or how the Chinese consumers were behaving when they came to their website. And that's very easy to do these days because if you have Google, even just Google Apps plugged into your, Google Analytics plugged into your website, you can do a country search and you can track, customer behavior. But before we get on to that, I wanted to kind of highlight to you the importance of language here, because the first step for us in this scenario was to ask the customer, what is your Chinese name? Do you have one? Because when we're doing our research in China, we wanted to know what the Chinese name was so we could find out what their Chinese customers were saying, and they didn't know. So they had no idea what their Chinese language name was. So we ended up doing that as a part of the research, and we jumped online and we quickly found out that the Chinese language name for Port Arthur, being commonly referred to by the Chinese who had already been there, was Yasiga. And because that hadn't been trademarked or taken, we decided to take that upon ourselves to register. And we adopted that as the permanent name, because when you're building a brand, you need to have some permanent assets, and your name and your logo is one of them. The second thing that we asked them is what language do people use when they're doing a Baidu search or Google search even to find you? What is the terminology used to identify Tasmania? Do Chinese people even know where Tasmania is? And so we did some research and we found that there are a couple of different uses, or a couple of different words that we used for Tasmania. One is Tasmania, Tasmania Zol, and then there was an abbreviated version which was Tazol. So that's really important when it comes to designing our website, to understand the language around how people find you, because as we all know, the words that we put on our website need to include important keywords because it helps our searchability. So the language research is really important, and I think that highlights nicely exactly why that was useful for us to know. So then the next step was to look at their pre-existing website and determine what was going wrong. Why were they not getting more bookings online from Chinese customers? And the things that we found was that their site navigation was just really complicated for an English speaker. So you could imagine a non-English speaker, a Chinese speaker, coming into the website and trying to navigate this really kind of complicated website. So the first thing we told them was, you need to fix your navigation. It's too hard. We can't understand it. There's no way anyone else can understand it. The other thing that we found is that they had a lot of links on the homepage, but none of the links were being used. So we told them to get rid of the links. The links aren't kind of turning into customers. They're not going to the next page. There's no engagement happening here because your links aren't working. Complicated navigation structure, complicated link structure. People don't know where to go when they get here. And the call to action wasn't clear. So where do I go to buy tickets? I want to go. I'm convinced. Let me do it. Where do I go? And so even the call to action was really complicated. And so they had to fix that up. Limited Chinese content. The kind of scary part about this was that the Chinese content, I don't know how they did it, but it had some Mandarin simplified characters mixed with traditional characters in the same text, which is a no-no. And then what they thought was Chinese actually turned out to be Japanese in some cases. So there were links there with Japanese and they were saying, there's our Chinese content. And I was saying, well, where? That's Japanese. So, you know, it is a complicated process. You need experts for the language part, and someone's going to have to proofread at the end. But making sure that you get your text and your formatting right is really critical because it can really annoy some people, or it can just turn customers off. They're like, wow, this website's been hashed together. They are so untrustworthy. What a dodgy company. They can't even afford to get translation right. The other thing that we found in the research was that people Chinese people went to Port Arthur for different reasons than Australian people. So in the Australian context, we were going to find out about the history of Australia and to learn about our history. What we found as the underwriting reason for Chinese people going there was they love the photography and the beauty of the destination. And so when we were looking online in China at Port Arthur, we were seeing all these stunning photos of old buildings and historical sites and landscapes. And clearly, it became really clear to us that, you know, photography was a really big element of that. But if you looked at the website, there were no good photos. Like, it wasn't attractive or appealing or made me want to go there to take photos. So if I was a Chinese customer, it was like, okay, interesting, yeah, maybe. Why would I go there? And we all know that, you know, photography is a big part of Chinese tourism. Chinese tourists love to take photos, love to share photos. And so in building the new website, what we decided was that adding a really visual element to the website, having lots of really great photos, uninterrupted scenes, was going to be an important part to selling that, you know, that product, selling those tickets to go to Port Arthur. And then the final thing that we did was we made it really simple for the customers to buy a ticket themselves. What Port Arthur was doing was putting their trust and faith and hope in travel agents who take hefty commissions, and they were doing the quick get in, get out, 3 things in a day type tour, which was not really a lot of money for Port Arthur. What we wanted to do was take some of that control and give it to Port Arthur. And the only way we could do that was to make a really nice and easy payment option for a Chinese customer, so that if they wanted to do that themselves, they could do that. So they're just some of the key points that helped us develop the Port Arthur Chinese language website. They actually built a separate language website to their English language website, but in recent years that's changed again and we no longer look after it. So it's slightly different again, but you can have a look online under portarthur.cn, I think it is. And you can see that some of the original kind of content still changed, but they effectively significantly increased their Chinese visitor rates year on year from the time that they put in place this brand new Chinese website, and their web traction was exceptional. I can't remember the stats now. And also they built up a social media strategy, which was really great tool as well to help them kind of drive sales and drive independent visitors to the actual site, which is obviously a higher revenue yield for Port Arthur because they're not paying commissions on people who buy tickets directly. So yeah, that's just a couple of the things that I think are really important and quite often forgotten when people go about the process of building a website. I see lots of websites that, you know, have just plugged in Google Translate at the top, and, you know, it's kind of ugly. When you read it, it's not very attractive. It's not appealing as a customer. I don't think it works, but certainly do your research. It's totally doable. There's heaps of apps and tools that you can plug in and utilize. I use Google Translate, as I mentioned, a lot, even in just doing daily business for me. Good luck with your endeavors, and I really would love to hear some of your questions and find out what your kind of real life challenges are in building your own websites, or if you have any questions kind of related to this topic.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. I think that word sums it up. You've really made it sound doable when it can seem a little bit overwhelming in the beginning. And I loved that slide where you showed the different websites in different cultures. And to me, I always find Chinese websites very busy, far too busy. And that's my sort of cultural background coming through. But I guess that means that Chinese consumers, they really do value that information as much as you can cram in, as well as possibility of getting discounts. So if you do have any questions, please ask them now via the Q&A button on the Zoom screen. As I mentioned, we will in a few minutes go to promote everybody to a panelist so we can have a bit of a discussion. But I might just ask a question of my own to start off with. So if you are a business who is on one of the e-commerce platforms, how important is it then for you to have a Chinese website for Chinese customers?
Yeah, I think you mean an e-commerce website?
Yeah.
So if you had like an Australian e-commerce platform and you were thinking about China, how important is it to have a Chinese version?
Yeah.
I think each industry is slightly different. Information is king. So if you can provide information to your customers, and in keeping in mind that only about 2% of China speaks English proficiently. If you don't have a Chinese language offer, your customers, unless someone else is telling them about you, are not going to be able to find you. You just don't exist. And you know, we did I went over to China with Tourism NT a few years back, and we visited one of the big travel OTAs, online travel platforms that sells travel and tourism packages online to Chinese consumers. And we did a Baidu search in China around Tourism NT and travel to Darwin, travel to the Northern Territory, travel, you know, what can you do in the NT? And there wasn't a lot of content, and it was really embarrassing. In fact, most of the travel companies that were on this delegation that went with us, their products didn't exist in China because they didn't have a Chinese language offer. So first and foremost, if you don't have a Chinese language offer, you don't exist. Now you can create that offer, or you can let someone else create it for you. But you essentially, if you own the brand, you want to own that offer. When it comes to e-commerce, you know, and it depends where you're selling to, whether it's cross-border trade whether it's selling locally to the Australian domestic Chinese market. And there are certain rules around e-commerce and trade, which is probably a bit big for this conversation, but our e-commerce presentation that we did a couple of weeks ago, people might want to go back and review that. You also need to plug in tools to make it accessible. So you need to make it Chinese, and you also need to give them tools such as WeChat Pay and Tencent Pay and or Alipay and you know, various tools. Otherwise, people may find you, may like you, but they may not have the capacity to actually purchase you. Because the other kind of big challenge is that many of the, you know, bank cards and credit cards that they use in China, the majority of them actually can't transact in foreign currency, or they have limited foreign currency capabilities. So, you know, they might not have the capacity to buy you even if they like you. So yes, having a web presence or a channel whereby even if you can't integrate the e-commerce to your own platform, educate your customers on your platform and send them to a platform that can take the transaction. And that's exactly what Port Arthur did. I mean, Port Arthur didn't, in those days, there weren't all of the tools available for them to just plug in, you know, WeChat Pay onto their website. They had to sign up with the Commonwealth Bank and they had to get an integration, and it was very expensive. They said, we don't want to do that, it's too hard. So what we did was we went to a third-party platform that sold tourism products who had those convenient e-commerce systems in their platform for customers. We pay them a commission and they highlight and sell those products for us and remit the money back to us. So Port Arthur educates the customer, converts the customer says, yes, I want to buy it, and the customer goes to, it's transported to another website, does the transaction, comes back. And the commission was much lower than, say, going through an agent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Good example. Now, we will promote everybody to a panelist so we can have a bit of a discussion, roundtable style. But so, Joanna, if you wouldn't mind starting that process. But in the meantime, you've referred to Chinese Australians, and a lot of companies are coming to us interested in membership because they want to understand how to engage with the Chinese community here in Australia. Did you want to just say a little bit about how Chinese language websites can help with engaging with Chinese people here in Australia as well?
Yes, of course. Well, I think that it's a really underutilised market. For me, I've always been kind of promoting the Australian Chinese community to my exporters and my cross-border traders, because they're here, they're with us, it's closer, it's quicker, it's more convenient, it's cheaper to market and advertise to them and connect with them, find out what they like, find out what they hate before we start spending a whole bunch of money pushing our products to China. So we have over 1 million, I think the latest stats 1.1 million, could even be more, of locally based Chinese, and they've become really important too in this COVID environment because no one can travel at the moment. So all of our inbound tourists, all of our international students, we've lost them for the last year and a half. And we've actually seen a lot of local companies that have China as a market kind of pivot and get the message and start to kind of target and focus on the local Chinese community. And there are lots of channels that you can use to do that. So firstly, your website, great tool, you know, have it in Chinese. It's certainly more convenient. I know a lot of Australian Chinese speak English, but hey, is it convenient or in your spare time to search websites in English? I don't search websites in Chinese for fun. I only do it for business because it's hard work. I search in English, and I imagine it's the same for the Chinese. But, you know, there are also lots of media platforms that you can utilise here in Australia too. So news media, there's, you know, Australia-specific Chinese language news media that you can tap into and use as a marketing tool. Australian Chinese use all the same apps as everyone back home. So WeChat, all of the different, you know, tools that you would imagine in China, they use here in Australia as well. Facebook, they don't really use it that much because their friends and relatives aren't really on it. And again, it's in English. So, you know, the importance of using Chinese social apps is really critical, even to market to local Chinese. And then you know, there are communities within Australia that are densely populated with Chinese community of people. So, you know, in New South Wales, we have Burwood, we have Hurstville, we have different communities. So you could do site activations for your brand or work with local shops or, you know, store holders to kind of really push your products through them to get the message out. And once you convince that local Australian Chinese community that your brand is the go-to brand, they will share that information back to their friends and relatives and family back in China. And they will start propagating WeChat and all of the social apps and sharing information about you, so that when those people in China are considering whether or not they want to buy from you, they will look online and they will see all these people talking about you, and then that will give them the confidence to commit. And, you know, like a really positive stat, I didn't put it on the slides today. I think it was a PayPal Ipsos research paper. If you just do a search under PayPal Ipsos cross-border trade research, Chinese people are very much inclined to buy globally. So they did a research on whether or not people from different countries had the confidence to buy internationally or buy cross-border, as they call it, and that Chinese have a high propensity. They're not just buying local anymore, they're also buying cross-border. And so if we can convince everyone here in Australia that yours is the go-to brand, and we've seen, you know, brands come up through those ranks, of Paw cream, very popular in China, a lot of our milk and dairy products, you know, even some little niche brands which have become popular in Australia and then organically flowed back to China. I'll give you a really good example, if you don't mind, if you don't want to ask another question first. We worked for a jam company. I'm pretty sure you'll know them. They're called Beerenberg. They're based in South Australia. And again, it was they had a hospitality export channel into China, but they wanted to develop a retail channel. And the first thing we did was our research. And the research was really interesting. We came back to them and said, do you know what? You're already famous in China. People already know about you. They're already buying your products. And that was when Daigou, you know, remember the Daigou was really big? Daigou were the people, the Chinese local community that were buying Australian products, taking them back to China and selling them as retail products. So what had happened is the Daigou community had got a whiff of the Beerenberg brand. They love their little small pots and jars of honey, particularly, and jam. They were making it popular. They were talking about it on WeChat. They were marketing it on WeChat. They were taking it back to China and selling it. And the brand owner didn't even kind of know about this little kind of black market communities as such. But it was interesting that was already established. So yeah, the local community, 100%, you must invest in it. It's a great, even if it's a partial strategy, you know, 20% of your budget to the Australian Chinese community and the remainder to China, you must consider them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Great example there of a company that was being sold in China without even realising that was the case. So those that have joined us in the meeting mode, we'd love to hear any questions or comments that you do have. Although we're recording this webinar, we won't include this part of the session on the recording that we upload. So feel very confident to just chip in as you feel as you would like to. It was really, I just want to say that research that you mentioned about the Chinese propensity to buy global was really interesting. And when you think about it, there is so little difference when you're talking about online sales between buying a Chinese product and buying an international product. And I think one of the trends that I've found really interesting about COVID is that where previously it was a younger demographic who purchased online, post-pandemic, older Chinese people have now got used to the idea of purchasing online, and they're now committed online shoppers. And so that again opens up a whole new demographic for Australia, a new you know, area of the market which we can now really target Chinese customers through e-commerce for.
Yeah, tap into. And I think it's especially relevant for smaller or medium-sized companies who don't necessarily have a huge budget, because, you know, selling to China requires a lot of budget. But for smaller and medium-sized companies who might not have that kind of significant budget just to spend on marketing to Chinese, it can also be a more cost-effective way to develop a proof of concept. Because as I said, the customers are here. It's quicker, cheaper, and easier to get to them. And with some of the tools that we've talked about today, you could feasibly develop a fairly simple Chinese web page, build it into your existing website, add some tools, e-commerce such as WeChat Pay, and then do some simple marketing activations. Go to the destinations where there's lots of Chinese people, sell, go into the shops, work with the local shop owners, think about some online marketing via Sydney Today, which is one of the Chinese news platforms, and different things like that. So there's plenty of options, and like I said, quicker, easier and cheaper to get you to the next level.
Exactly. And we've been focusing a lot on cost control in this webinar. Would you say that it's not necessary to spend a lot of money on translation? For example, could you use Google Translate and then get a Chinese native speaker to just double check it, do a sense check, edit it? Is that something that would help in keeping costs down, as opposed to hiring a Chinese copywriter to translate your website from the start?
I believe that for a website, you should get a paid translator, and I think they're not as expensive as you might imagine. I don't believe, there's a myth that they're really expensive, and they're not that expensive, but you need to be selective, and that's where your research comes in. You don't necessarily need to translate your whole website, but good marketing copy, it doesn't matter what language it is, it's always going to sell products. So be selective, do your research, choose the bits that you need to translate, the critical bits, and use the Google Translate more for tools to communicate. So, reading a message from a customer in Chinese, or talking to a customer, trying to communicate with them in store, or like Skype, for example, using that to communicate with a customer in China if they have a question. Use that more for those types of interactions. But for your website, I would prefer, you can do it. A lot of people have done it and then gone on to improve their Chinese language content. But if money is a problem for you, at least the homepage, a couple of $100, translated, beautiful marketing copy, and then work towards developing the remainder when you can afford it. Good translation is better than rubbish translation, but it's not better than no translation.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Okay. All right. Well, we will have to wrap it up because we do try to keep these sessions to 1 hour. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you to Lisa for what was a really useful webinar. We'll put the content online so it's a resource for people in an ongoing way. And thank you for our audience. Stay tuned to our upcoming events. We're putting more and more on the website. Unfortunately, we won't be doing live events for at least another month, maybe 2. Fingers crossed that we get out of this lockdown sooner rather than later. But thank you, everyone, and I wish you